Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Hey, welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these very critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. Spent some time just before we started the podcast today responding to some of the comments from previous podcasts. There's a lot going on, of course, especially in Canadian politics and Canada-U.S. relations, and we've tried to touch on a lot of those issues, and I always appreciate your input into this, pro or con. You can agree or disagree, whatever the case may be, but it makes for a better podcast and gives us some direction, too, so please keep those comments coming. And thanks to all, by the way, for subscribing, too, because your support through your subscription, of course, can help us continue to do the work here on the podcast. Now, for today, maybe this is a request, I guess. Please don't get suckered in by the conservative spin that's happening here about the upcoming federal budget, okay? We've talked about this on a couple of the previous podcasts, but the spin doctors, the Andrew Scheers and others, and of course Poilievre himself, have already started to play the blame game here and simply say, well, you know what, if this budget fails, if there's not enough support for the Carney budget, and we are thrown into an election, it's all the Liberals' fault because of all the stuff that they put in there. Bull. All right, I'll let you finish the rest of that word, because it's just not true. I mean, this is exactly what's happening here, because we already know this is a minority government, and they don't have enough votes because of the situation. The numbers tell the story there. We get all that, and they're going to need some support from some of the opposition members to get this thing passed. And the opposition members know that, so they're playing politics too. By the way, we had a really great conversation about this whole dynamic just a couple of days ago with Dr. Laurie Turnbull, who's been a longtime guest. I had her on the radio show many times, and we've been great to have her on the podcast. And she did an episode from just a couple of days ago talking about the political dynamic and the gamesmanship that's going on. If you haven't heard that one, go back in the archive and check it out. I think you'll find it very interesting and very insightful. Anyway, let's talk about the present day here. Andrew Scheer was on one of the CBC shows, I guess, saying that his party thinks the government is trying to force an election by putting stuff in the budget that they know that the Conservatives won't support. They're putting stuff in the budget, Mr. Scheer, that they have campaigned on. There's nothing there from what we know already. We don't have all the details until Mr. Champagne gets up and addresses the House in just a couple of days. But these are things that Carney has talked about from day one, about investing in infrastructure. And yes, it costs money to bring us back to where we are. And anybody that doesn't understand that probably doesn't have any business sitting in the House of Commons, because that's the reality here. If you want to create infrastructure spending, if you want to invest, you've got to spend money to do it. You can't just sit there and wish that things are going to get better. So investing in things like Carney has talked about the Churchill port redevelopment, about mining and finally starting to get the Ring of Fire mineral stuff going, on and on and on. There's a number of different projects that he's talked about here, and he's talked about those lists that he's talked with the premiers about from time to time. And by the way, let's remind ourselves that there was a time, it was back in June, where the Conservatives seemed to get that. There was the most contentious bill in the very short time that the Carney government was able to act before they all scattered away for their summer vacation. Bill C-5, the infrastructure bill, essentially, that was presented, and it did pass with the support of the Conservatives. I know that caused an awful lot of people to say, they what? But it was the right thing to do. And you may remember the picture, because we talked about it on the podcast, of Prime Minister Carney reaching across the aisle, literally going across the aisle and shaking hands with Andrew Scheer, who was the House leader for the Conservatives then, because they supported the bill, and it was the right thing for Canada to do. It's worth noting, by the way, that Pierre Poilievre was not in the House. He was technically not allowed to be because he'd lost his seat. The Conservatives didn't win the election. Poilievre got booted out of his own seat in Ottawa, and he was busy doing whatever he was doing out in West to try to regain a seat, which has happened. So I don't know. I don't know if a Poilievre-led Conservative Party would have supported that. Because Poilievre, of course, is so stuck in his own ideology, he's not looking at what's going on around the nation and around the world these days. Mr. Carney, quite differently, is looking at the perspective and saying, what can we do here? What needs to be done here? He's taking a business approach and an economic approach to this and saying, how can we make Canada better? Poilievre is just saying, how can I boot these guys out so I can become prime minister? I want to be in that corner office. That's not the sort of ideology, nor is it kind of a motivation that we want from our political leaders, but, such as it is. So to his credit, the Prime Minister, before he went off on his trip down to the Orient and to South Korea this past week, which, by the way, is apparently already starting to become fruitful because of the possibility of more trade deals, but he did meet with the other opposition leaders. And trying to build some bridges so that we can move forward as a country and make this parliament work, which is what we as voters did. That was the mandate we gave everybody last spring in the election. All right. You got this many votes. You got this many votes. The Liberals have the power right now. Mark Carney is the prime minister. Now get to work. Quit your bickering and stop acting like children and get to work. Well, apparently Poilievre never got that message, or if he did, he just doesn't want to pay attention to it. So Prime Minister Carney met with the leaders. He met with Mr. Blanchet, who typically, of course, just gave this big, long list of demands. Give us more money, give Quebec more money, do this, do that, which I always am somewhat dismissive of. Because Mr. Blanchet doesn't give a damn about the rest of the country. All he wants to do is get enough support in Quebec so that he can get reelected and justify his own existence. That's what that party has always been about, and that's certainly what he's about. So, Quebec plays an important part in our country and our confederation. Sure it does. But so do the other provinces, and he just doesn't seem to get that. So take everything he says with a grain of salt. I know I do. He met with Mr. Davies, who was the interim leader of the NDP, who, of course, don't even have official status right now. Now, they have not officially said they're not going to support the budget, but they're saying, well, we want to see investments in the structure. And he doesn't like the word austerity. Well, I don't care if you like the word or not, Mr. Davies. I mean, we're in a very tough economic situation right now, and it's going to cause some tough decisions to have to be made. And some people are not going to like what's going to have to happen here. But that's what you do when you get your fiscal house in order. It doesn't mean you stop spending. It means you spend wisely to make sure there's going to be a return on those investments. The Prime Minister has been very clear on that. So I don't know where the NDP are going to go on this. It kind of sounds to me as if Mr. Davies is stuck in that same old ideology that NDP always have. They just don't seem to get economic development. And that's a problem. And seems as if, and that's hopefully it's not an epidemic among NDP, because even Alberta elected an NDP government a few years ago with Rachel Notley because she understood it. She was more pragmatic than a lot of the NDPers when it came to oil and the economy. Others not so much so, which is maybe one of the reasons why they have never really grasped power at the federal level. So I don't know how the NDP are going to vote on that. But then, of course, the Prime Minister met with Mr. Poilievre. And Poilievre, of course, was typical Poilievre, just entrenched and say, this is what I want if you want our support. I want the deficit to be this. I want you to get rid of the carbon tax. And basically, what he said was all the stuff that he used as part of his campaign in the last election in the springtime. Well, Canadians rejected that, Mr. Poilievre. Do you recall? All right, so why would the Liberals say, oh, yeah, we'll incorporate all that stuff in there? That's not the mandate. The mandate, you don't go get, Poilievre still doesn't get it. You didn't win. You're not the prime minister. You don't get to make the rules here. You get to vote on what's going on, and you can vote up or down. So this folly that Andrew Scheer and some of the other conservatives are coming up with right now, that if this vote fails and the Liberals do not get the support for the budget, it's their fault. Bull, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. The Conservatives have a decision to make and stand by that and live with the consequences. And the consequences, by the way, could be severe. The polling we talked about just a couple of podcasts ago indicated that by almost 2-to-1 margin, Canadians are saying, don't bring the government down. Don't cause another election. Don't do it. Well, when they get that strong a message from the public, and that's what's happening right now, and they go ahead and do this anyway, that severe consequence may well be they may just say, you know what, the heck with you guys then. And oftentimes the government that was trying to move forward, such as the Carney government is right now, is usually rewarded and rewarded with a larger number of people. In other words, a majority to try to get that mandate done. So the Conservatives are playing with fire here, but they're always trying to back off and say, oh, it's not our fault. It's not, yeah, it is, okay? If you put the car in gear and drive it towards the cliff and it goes over the cliff, it's your fault for doing that. Don't start blaming other people for that. But as we mentioned, the spin guys are already working their ways to do that. Scheer making his statements. An op-ed piece I saw on Substack the other day from Fred Delory. Now, Mr. Delory, you may know the name, He's a former national campaign manager for the Conservative government in the 2021 election. He worked in the Stephen Harper administration, too. I think he was the director of political operations. And you see him on Power and Politics on CBC on David Cochran's show. It's one of those, I told you, I don't like those panel discussions. Here's the Conservative, here's the Liberal, here's the NDP, and they're just going to spout their political ideologies. But, I guess when you have to fill 2 hours every day, you have to have those things on there. Delory seems like a nice enough guy, but he's a hard and fast conservative. So what do you expect him to do? Sure, he's going to say it's going to be all the Liberals' fault if this happens, that they have to cave into what Mr. Poilievre wants if he wants to survive. Well, that's not the way things work. Mr. Delory seems to think that we are headed for an election. It's inevitable. Stop pretending it isn't. That's up to the Conservative Party. All right? It's not inevitable. It can work, but it's going to have to take some flexibility and some understanding by all the parties. This is the governing party. This is their mandate. This is their plan forward. It's as simple as that. And nobody likes the fact that it's going to cost an awful lot of money, but it's going to cost an awful lot of money. To think otherwise is naive. And for God's sakes, we can't have a government that's going to run with these naive approaches, that everything's just going to be fine and dandy if we just stick to our own ideologies. The whole thing about politics, successful politics, and moving a country forward, especially in these challenging times, is to be able to pivot, to understand the realities of what's going on, and maybe to be able to simply say, okay, we're going to have to modify some of these beliefs, some of these demands. Maybe we're going to have to do some things that we're not crazy about, but they're the right thing to do. And the Conservatives just don't seem to get that. They really don't. And that's, I think, evidenced by the last number of times that they've selected a leader. Poilievre clearly doesn't get it. I mean, this is a guy who is not qualified even to be in the job as opposition leader. But and before them, there was Andrew Scheer and others. They just don't seem to resonate. They're not listening to Canadian people. They're dictating to Canadian people, this is what you should like and this is what you should be thinking about. They're not listening. You can hear and not listen. And that's a lesson the Conservatives are just going to have to learn. Mr. Carney is listening. He's listening to people in the communities, even during these tough times dealing with Donald Trump and others. He's got an advisory panel. He's talking to business leaders. He's talking to labor leaders. These are the people that he's in contact with constantly to get what's happening and to get that feedback. And it's not an ivory tower. It's an opportunity to engage the Canadian public, and that's what the Prime Minister has done here. And I think it's beholden to the Canadian people, and especially from the people we just talked about, the Poilievres, the Blanchettes, for what it's worth, and the others, that they have to understand that they need to listen to the Canadian people as well. And the Canadian people right now are saying, don't dissolve this Parliament. Let's move forward, okay? Let's give this guy a shot, as evidenced by the fact that, when they say who is the preferred prime minister, the most recent polling, Prime Minister Carney has about a 25-point lead over Poilievre. And should I remind you again about the poll that was released in the summertime that said that almost half of Canadians would be embarrassed, it's a pretty strong word, embarrassed if Pierre Poilievre was our prime minister. So if the Conservatives think that they can bring this government down and they're going to coast to a victory in the next election, again, you guys need a reality check. You're playing political games here, and that's the last thing we as Canadians want to see right now. We're looking for people that can work together to try to get this thing done, like they did with Bill C-5 back before they went on their summer break. That's the kind of cooperation. There should be input back and forth, but you have to do that with some mutual respect. This is the government. That is the Prime Minister. These are the programs. And they're not suggesting, that the infrastructure projects that they're talking about doing are not going to work. They just say, well, that's their idea, so we will oppose that. That's not how government works. And that's not the way Canadians want to see this government work. So I'm just saying right back at you, Conservatives, whether it's Andrew Scheer, whether it's Fred Delory or others, you can talk about the spin all you want, but Canadians are not stupid. They're not naive. They understand exactly what's going on. There's a budget here. The numbers are going to come out. Minister Champagne's going to talk about just where they're going to spend their money, what they like to see in return. And by the way, that's part of the budget discussion as well, return on investment. All right, it's not always dollar for dollar, but we're going to spend this because it's going to upgrade this particular piece of the economy, whether it's transportation, whether it's whatever it might be, any different facet of it, and there's going to be money coming back in. And that's how governments operate, and that's how governments get out of the situation that they're in right now. We've been down this road before, need I remind you, and it was just after the Mulroney government finally left office, well, by Kim Campbell by then, because Mulroney had bailed. But we were in a terrible, terrible economic situation. The debt was terrible. The deficits were terrible. The national debt was out of control. And it took the Chrétien government and Paul Martin as the finance minister a couple of elections to kind of get things turned around. It doesn't happen overnight. And again, that's part of the naivety, I think, that the Conservatives are trying to get us to believe in. And we're not buying it. You can't snap your fingers and say everything's going to be fine now. It's going to take time to turn this around. And we've done it before. We went from one of the worst economic situations in this country's history after the Mulroney years and turned it around, and we ended up with 10 or 11 years of surpluses. Surpluses. And by the way, they didn't flitter that money away either. The surplus, half of it went to infrastructure, half of it went to pay off the national debt. And as opposed to what previous prime ministers like Mulroney and Harper did, which essentially ran up the national debt. So that's fiscal responsibility. It's a term that the Conservatives love to talk about, but they don't really practice. So let's talk about the guy who's doing it now and who's presenting the plan for this now. So watch carefully. And as we've said, I know I'm going to repeat this time and time again, but I'm going to repeat it because it's so essential. Don't just listen to what they say. That's the rhetoric. That's the spin. Watch what they do. Watch what they're proposing, because that's where you really get an idea as to where they're governing and just where their responsibilities are and where their priorities are. It's pretty clear where the prime minister's coming from here. The opposition parties are just playing, basically, let's block this, let's block that. That's not effective government. That's not responsible government. And that's not the kind of politician that we need right now. So we'll be watching this, and as always, of course, looking for your feedback with this. That's it for this edition of the podcast. If you're on YouTube, great to have you with us. Don't forget to hit that notification bell for us. And as we mentioned at the beginning, thanks again to everybody for their support through your subscriptions. We continue to do the work here. We continue to create this dialogue back and forth with Canadians, and your support really helps us to be able to do that. Thanks as always to Madeline Kelly for the great work producing the show as always today. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.